All right, y'all. As promised, I was going to walk through a results comparison in my own room, kind of with my evolution of using MSO over the past several months. I've had some pretty big improvements in my mind, and then certainly they're audible, and I can actually show measurements to back those up as well using RumiQ Wizard. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I think I mentioned at the end of the last video, you know, results are the only thing that matters, and that's what we're going to go through here today. I'm going to walk through. I think I've got 5 different sets of measurements. One is a native response, no EQ, no alignment, no nothing, no gains, no delays, just straight up. Add my subs up. This is what they look like. I've got 2 options where I have it's an MSO optimization, but these use the PEQ gain and delay limits that are allowable in the mini DSP 2x4 HD. So as an example, the gain limits I think are plus or minus 16 dB on the 2x4 HD, a ridiculous 80 milliseconds delay. The maximum Q goes from 1 to 20, so it allows hyper narrow filters. And then I think those are the big differences, or the big limits rather that we care about. The next one is this is a tip that I've always heard this tip about not using really narrow Q filters, but I'd never had the time or the inclination to experiment with it. Again, I was helping a guy learn MSO, and we were chatting back and forth, and while we were waiting for an optimization to run, and I asked him about this, and and he's like, yeah, this is a legitimate thing. You should experiment with it in your room. So I did, and we're going to walk through what happens and walk through the results when I limited the max Q from the mini DSP max, which is again the Q at 20. I limited it to something a lot lower, and I'll get down to the specific number that I used. You might end up with something slightly different, but I think what I use is probably a good starting point, particularly for those of you that have the 2x4 HD with up to 10 filters in it. And then the last one that we'll look at is the same Q filter bandwidth limit, but then I say sub-channel gain limitations. And what that really is this is me using MSO 1.1.6. And the new default gain structuring on the sub. So rather than letting it go plus or minus 16 dB, it's using plus or minus 6. And we'll see what the results look like there. All of these have all room correction disabled. This is just native MSO, native mini DSP for all of these measurements. So, whoops, we'll go a little preview there. Let's jump into RumiQ Wizard, and we'll start walking through things. So this is the native response of my subs. They actually align pretty well. There's not a lot of negative summation when I just stick them together with no delay. This is just this big null right here is really just a mic placement thing. Depends on how accurate I get with it, so not a huge thing to worry about. But I just wanted to give you a good comparison, because what we're going to look at and compare this to is these 4 additional optimizations. So there's 2 here. These are using the mini DSP limits. Great, right? These are really good, nice and tight, plus or minus like 2.5 dB, all the way up to about 120 hertz or so. And then I've got 2 more where I've got some other experimentation that I did, right? And we're going to look at the impact of what these had and why I think in particular that this trace is the one that sounds the best. You're going to notice that these 2 traces in particular don't look quite like the others. These are mic placement issues because I took these measurements at very different times. So for example, in this one has a little bit of a tilt kind of up and to the right. Just ignore that. That wasn't there when I did the initial verification. Same thing in this one. This one looks like it has a kind of a bit of a null just above 70 hertz. That wasn't there when I did the initial verification. I just couldn't find the exact files that I used for those. So overall, these are all very flat responses. However, they sound very different. And I think the easiest way and easiest place to see that is on the spectrogram. If you haven't used the spectrogram is pretty slick. It is The easiest way to think about it is a top-down view of the waterfall graph. So I'll pull up a waterfall really quick just to show you what that looks like. So this is the waterfall for my base response. So you can kind of see, how loud it is, and then kind of coming out at us is the ringing in the room. That's the how long the bass is hanging around. So you can kind of see where you're getting a lot of resonance and such. And this is great for certain things. Like, I typically will set my time range here to like 450 milliseconds, which is a pretty good value to target for like RT time. So this will tell me, hey, I've got something weird going on here at 55 hertz, right? So that's something I might want to look at. It's pretty common to lose control lower, but and this is pretty useful, right? So it's useful for that kind of a thing. But if we look at the same thing from the top down on the spectrogram, things get a little bit more interesting, okay? What I like with this is, first of all, we can kind of see the perspective on the waterfall, right? Our loudest areas are red, our quietest areas are in blue. But what this allows you to do is, under the controls, there's this little checkbox for normalizing the peak at each frequency. If I uncheck that, you're going to see that looks a lot more like what we saw in the waterfall over here. There's one area of high red around 24 hertz. If I go back to the, wrong button. If I go back to the waterfall over here, hey, look, it's all lined up right there at 24 hertz or so. So that's what we're seeing. But in the spectrogram, I can normalize these things and I can get a much better comparison. Basically, it shows the loudest frequencies in the same color. So you can see just more easily compare measurements from one to the other. So when we start talking about things like narrow EQ, or really narrow EQ filters, really narrow Q bandwidth, I mentioned that there's downsides to that. And probably the biggest change that I made is limiting and not using a full 20Q filter. The specific value that I experimented with and that I liked really well was actually used a 1/6 octave wide PEQ, or Q on my PEQ. And that equates to a Q of 8.651. So that's a 1/6 octave Q. And we're going to walk through and I'll show you the differences in how it shows up here on the spectrogram. So the first thing that we want to think about is what's a good, decay time or good, reverb time in a room. We're not really looking at reverb, but we want to look and figure out, how do I know where I've got modes that are lingering and really ringing in the room? And just a rough estimate, a rough target for that is about 450 milliseconds. So I'm going to click on this line, put it right at about 450 milliseconds. And we can see that up until the low frequencies, where it's generally, you're going to lose control of things really, really low, especially if you're not, putting big bucks into a custom built theater. Everything before is pretty good, right? But if you remember, that magnitude response was pretty choppy, and everybody likes a really flat magnitude response. But I'm about to show you that a flat response doesn't necessarily equal better, right? So all four of these optimizations had a really flat response. We saw that, right? So here is the first of the mini DSP efforts. And we can see that we've got some peaks that are starting to linger and draw out above that 450 millisecond line. A number that I personally like to look at is, where are these peaks down by about 10 dB, right? Because they're still audible at that 10 dB, and how long are they taking to get there? So 10 dB down is kind of roughly in this yellowy green area. So, this is kind of that worst offender. And if I click this here, I can see that we're still taking almost 200 milliseconds to get that energy out of the room. And that's just, again, it's a good indicator that we've got some ringing going on there. Another piece to look at when we're looking at this spectrogram is this dotted line. This dotted line is the peak energy line. So that's telling you how long does it take to get the maximum sound at a given frequency, right? It's very, very similar. It's not quite, but it's very, very similar to something called group delay. A good target that I was told by someone in the industry, a good target for group delay is to be within two cycles at a given frequency. So the easy one to pick is at 100 hertz. That's about an 11 millisecond cycle. So we should be about 22 milliseconds. And we're pretty close to that right now, right? But when we get down to 45 hertz, our cycle times, the wavelength's longer, but so is our cycle time. So I think at 45 hertz, if I do some really quick math on this, 1130, I know you guys can't see that, but divided by 45. So a 45 hertz tone, one wavelength is 25 milliseconds long. So ideally, I would have that decayed, and I'd hit peak energy at 50 milliseconds, and you can see that I'm going almost a full cycle above that. So this is not as good as it could be, right? Not as good as it could be. So again, I thought this sounded great, but notice like I didn't have it optimized all the way out to 200 hertz. We'll talk about why that's important in my room here in a minute. And I still had some anomalies and stuff happening here that I really wasn't happy with. So if we go to the second mini DSP example, we've got even more ringing. And our group delay is even worse. Well, it's not quite as bad up here. Not group delay, our peak energy time. It's not quite as bad. But if I look at it over at 100 hertz, we're way above that cycle limit, right? We're starting to get into 3 cycles rather than that 2 cycle limit that we really want to target. I think in pro audio, they target more like 1.5. You can get there, but it takes a ton of time, a ton of money, and like a ton of room treatments to really get that down. And again, when we get out to that 200 hertz range, things start to kind of get out of control again. We've got a lot of peaky response, and we can see that in the magnitude graph as well. Now, what gets really interesting to me is when we start looking at these 2 options that have limited bandwidth. So again, the only change, these are the same 10 PEQ filters, same gain, same delay limits that the other ones had, but this one has that Q limited to that 8.651. If I click on this, things look a lot better. We still got a little bit of stuff lingering out here below 40 hertz, but overall, everything is below that 450. We don't have anything touching that line. I'm still not super happy with what we're doing on the, oops, let me see if I can get it here. Sorry, I'm thinking the wrong graph. So if you also notice our group delay is much, much better, particularly at that 100 hertz and down for the bass. So my bass has gotten a lot tighter. It's gotten a lot more accurate. It's not slow bass that we're hearing that's taken a while to get out into the room. And that's really true, again, except for that kind of 45 hertz range where it's kind of out of whack again, right? So what can I do to try to get this better? What can I do to improve this? And I wasn't really looking at this when I did the optimization. I was really just looking to experiment so I could tell new people what to expect when I was trying to help them out. So I said, okay, well, I'll take my same limit, and then I'm going to run it through, and I'll show you why I think this went away when we get to the gains and delays differences between these. But when I limited the gains to plus or minus 6 dB, let me put that 450 up there again, then this is what I ended up with. Much, much better group delay across the entire frequency response. Remember I said I had a microphone issue and there was a little bit of a notch at a little over 70 hertz. That's what we're seeing here. That doesn't, if I could find the original measurements, this wouldn't be here. It would look nice and tight, smooth all the way across. So, ignore this noise. This is basically noise from a bad measurement or different microphone position. But again, that group delay or that peak energy time is much, much better across the board. At 100 hertz, we're right at, well, it looks like we're right at 1 cycle. A little hard to zoom in on this, and we're right at 1 cycle on the peak energy. And in fact, if I go look at a group delay graph, there's a little bit of more wiggle in here than I would care for, but it's right on the edge, and it's much, much better than the previous iteration. So we can see that the combination of the narrower of the wider filters and then getting the sub gains dialed in has had a pretty measurable improvement on like ringing and just the amount of energy that's in the room. I'm going to look at this again really quickly, just from a group delay perspective. If you don't know what group delay is how long a sound at a particular frequency takes to get to you relative to the other frequencies, right? In a perfect world, everything would be 0 group delay. everything would arrive at the exact same time, and we'd be all, we wouldn't have to worry about it. But we don't live in a perfect world. Nulls and peaks introduce group delay. They're just a fact of life in small acoustics. So here we can see, again, my native response. I'm going to put it at 20 milliseconds because we're really just going to look at about 100 hertz down. These all have slightly different optimization options as far as MSO goes from a range perspective. I think some might be only optimized up to 120 hertz, while I think the last two go all the way up to 200. So we're going to look at that 100 hertz and below, and we're going to try to stay within that 2 cycles. So you can see here, 2 cycles is about 22 milliseconds, and we're right a hair above that. Definitely not enough to be audible in my room anyway. So again, if we go to the DSP, the first option, pretty good here, but things get way out of whack. Again, kind of at that mid 45 hertz range. And I always thought something was a little bit off. I could hear, and this isn't quite in that chest punch range, which is like that 50 to 80 hertz range, but there was always something a little bit off about some of that chest punch sound, like the shotgun scene and the tunnels in John Wick. The punch it was just a little bit, it wasn't quite right. The big guns in Hacksaw Ridge, when the battleship is shelling the ridge, it wasn't quite right. And the only anomaly that I can identify that went away with the last one is this, and I don't have that feeling anymore. So that's where I say that this actually sounds better, and I can hear and feel a difference. So the second one, again, same type of thing. Group delay is really out of whack on this one. It looks like it's good, but here's 0. So everything has been shifted up by about 20 milliseconds, which is just not good. So let's take a look at our 1/6. Much better. Here's our 0. Really, really good in through here. And then again, that same kind of 45, 46 hertz peak that I had earlier. And then the last one, getting the gains dialed in. Now it looks really nice. Again, that 70 hertz dip, that's this big drop. So don't worry about that guy. It's up from Super Troopers. That guy, you don't got to worry about that guy. A little bit of a measurement anomaly there. But group delay is really, really good across the board in this last one again. And I think getting the gains correct, I think is the key to that. And I think I have a reason. I think I know why. So I think the big thing that I've learned is, we went through a bunch of kind of tips and reminders and recommendations at the end of the last video. And I'm going to make one more in this one. And this is kind of the key thing that I learned that I hinted at. That thing about using really narrow filters is real, and I'm glad I got to experiment with it and not just blindly trust that it is. I'm glad I got to hear the results in my own room. Those narrow filters do introduce audible ringing, and we saw that in the spectrogram. It's really obvious in my room at that 45 hertz frequency. You could see everything kind of bumped up and went out. Then you could also see it on the group delay chart, right? Even though my frequency was flat, I still had some really weird, slow, laggy sounds in my room, and I was really able to end up cleaning it up. This one was it makes sense to me. I'd love to have Andy chime in if he watches this and helps me out here and confirms I'm either right or wrong. But the wider filters helped me get a flatter response over a much higher bandwidth, a much larger range. I mentioned earlier that those optimizations. I'm not even showing the right presentation. Let me flip over and show you guys that. Here, this is a little bit better. You could see, I mentioned those optimizations that I had some varying optimization ranges from like 20 to 120 hertz and maybe 150 in one. But now I'm able to get a flat response from where my low end, which is 15 or 16 hertz, is where I stop optimizing. My subs start to fall off and I just let them. So from 16 hertz all the way to 200 hertz, I can get plus or minus 2.5 dB, no problem. And that was something I was never able to do. And that's really important in my room. One of the best practices has always been, you want to optimize an EQ for a full octave above your selected crossover frequency. And that's because we want to make sure that when our LPF starts to roll off at that 12 dB, that we're able to meet that and that we get a nice smooth integration as our other speaker starts to roll on and play. And I wasn't ever able to get all the way there in my room. I'll try to flip over to REW and show you that here in a minute, just give you some ideas with the target curve in the EQ and show you what I'm talking about. my Atmos speakers are at a, almost probably see one there. They're at they have to cross them over at 100 hertz to get good sound out of them. But if I couldn't optimize past 120, I never really got the smooth integration that I wanted between them. Now I'm flat to 200. So when that 100 hertz 12 dB, or when that 100 hertz 12 dB high pass starts to roll in and cross over on that speaker, I get a nice, smooth, even response, nice, smooth, even integration. And as I mentioned, my personal results were the best with a 1/6 octave. That's a Q of that 8.651. I did experiment with some even broader Q filters. I think I experimented with I think I did I think I just did some real simple 1/2, 1/4, 1/3, 1/6. And I ended up with 1/6 being the best. I really didn't want to go above that and get any sharper than 1/6. So feel free to play with it. Feel free to experiment with it. Every room is a little bit different. Every room has its own unique challenges and stuff. So don't be afraid to play with this cue. And just maybe this is a good starting point for you. I think that's the last slide. Oh, I was going to go into measurements then at the end. That's why I didn't bring up REW earlier. See? So I mentioned one of the things that I thought helped clear up that that 45 hertz peak was the getting the gains in line on my subs. So here you can see these are the four. These are the four different ones for these two. I didn't include every single thing in here. I didn't include my one of the mini DSP optimizations because I couldn't find it. But this is typical of what I would have, right? I would have, if baseline's everything flat, this guy's down almost 10 dB, which is 10x the power down compared to the rest of them. Even here 8 dB, 7 dB, there's another 8 dB for these other ones. But tightening up that gain, I'm basically plus or minus about 3.5 dB on all subs. And they're very tightly aligned. They all come on at the same time, which is nice. I use the auto on feature on my rhythmic subs, which is what Brian over at Rhythmic recommends with Hypex, his Hypex amps. They all come on at the same time. They all play at the same time. It's great. The other benefit is in these delays. Again, I had some delays that were kind of big and kind of out of whack, right? 16, and again, these aren't huge delays for low end frequencies, but I think between getting I would have to go digging through my MSO optimizations and look at every single PEQ filter and graph those out and see what stuff looks like. I don't usually allow a lot of gain in my optimizations. I usually limit it to 3 or maybe 4.5 dB of gain if I'm getting really aggressive with it, but I think getting for individual PEQ filters, so I think what I probably had is one of these subs. I'm guessing my left front sub was what MSO kind of ended up wanting to use for those to help EQ that, and that's where that peak kind of came from, right? Because when I got the gains all in line, that peak just doesn't appear, right? We don't have that big delay. And again, if you look that same. Here maybe it's the delay of the sub. I don't know for sure. Like I said, I'll have to go crawling through to figure it out. But it did make a big difference, and it is audible in my room. So I think that is actually the last slide. It is. So again, just want to run through the comparison of these, kind of give you some data and back up what I thought I heard in my room with my optimization with some real data showing that spectrogram and the impact of those really really narrow bandwidth PEQ filters. I did mention I might jump back into REW. This video is pretty long already, 24 minutes. I'll give you one example of why it's important to optimize to 2x the crossover frequency if you're able. So let me flip over there real quick. And I'm just going to go back to my all SPL, and I'm just going to use let me pick one here. That's the one I'm actually using, so we'll use it. And then we'll pick maybe this guy. So that looks like that definitely looks like I optimized a lot lower than 200 hertz. So get rid of those guys and we'll compare these two. So what you can do is this one here is the one we're going to jump into first. If I pull up the EQ window, I should have this already set up, and I do, thank goodness. Let me get it to where you guys can see it. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So what we have here is this is my chosen one. This is one I like the most, one that sounds the best. And I've got a target curve set up here that basically simulates a 100 hertz crossover. It's set at 100 hertz. It's got a 12 dB roll off, right? So what that means is that over 1 octave, it's going to drop the sub level down by 12 dB. Because we're at 100 hertz, that means that at 200 hertz, it's going to be down 12 dB from whatever the target level is. So in this, I've got it at 87 dB, so I should be at 200 hertz or at 75 dB, which I am. So this is what the subs portion of the crossover will look like. This is the high pass filter piece of the crossover. And you can see I've got plenty of overhead in here to just let the room correction software take care of that. And this sub is going to be able to integrate really, really well and really smoothly with those overhead speakers in my room, my Atmos speakers. I think my mains and everything are crossed over around 80 or 90 hertz. I'd have to go look, but you can see there's plenty of bandwidth in there, plenty of overhead to EQ that down. Now, what does this look like if you don't have that? So let's pick this other, I think I chose measurement 2. So if we look at measurement 2, which is this other trace that I have up here, you can see it kind of it rolls off because I didn't have good measurements taken, or I didn't have enough bandwidth in there, using really narrow filters, not enough PEQs to make it look as good as I wanted. So if I go back to PEQ for that guy and make this as big as I can, here's a good example. Remember, 12 dB at an octave is where we're going to be. My room EQ system is going to have to try to fill in these nulls with PEQ to try to get a smooth integration between my Atmos speaker and my sub array with the behind MSO. That is why we want to try to EQ to 1 octave above our highest crossover that we're using. So just wanted to give you a visual representation of that and why I was so happy to be able to get something that why getting this result all the way out to 200 was so important to me in my room. It made a big difference in the sound. So anyway, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. As always, hit me up with questions, comments, when I get this posted up on YouTube. And y'all have a great day.